guys, we're here to talk about what it means for us as FIEC churches to be churches that plant churches. And in one sense, we're all part of one story of churches that have planted churches in Birmingham. So I think the place to start is really with what came first, which was City Church moving from being really quite an accidental and perhaps a reluctant church planter to planting church, to becoming a church that decided to plant its own daughter church 7 or so years into City Church's life. And that was Grace Church in Sturchley Cotteridge under your leadership, Andy. And I think as I look back, it was quite a big decision for us as a church, but the whole church family were really excited about the idea that we might be able to do more by planting into a part of the city where a number of City Church folk already lived and had a vision for that community. And you were able to go and lead that with a bunch from City Church. How did you find it looking back now, sort of 8 years or so into that experience?
Yeah, it's funny to think, because you were in Birmingham before me, but just kind of looking back, having been in the city, I think it's 20 years this year, and just kind of, when I came to Birmingham as an undergraduate, I never imagined that I'd even still be in Birmingham 20 years later, let alone actually having been involved in a couple of church plants and being part of something more significant is really exciting. You were hugely generous, though, as a church. I mean, we started with 33, 34 people, and little did we know at the time, but the church was planted pregnant with all sorts of opportunity, and not least you, John, because you were part of that core team at the time, and we just had no idea as to where the Lord might lead different people into different places, and folks who had been part of City, who then became part of Grace Church, are now involved in churches in New Zealand, Middle East, Manchester even, Oxford. Yeah, just it's remarkable kind of looking back and just seeing that far more has happened than we had imagined at the time.
One of the differences, of course, is we were accidental church planters. We started a church just because we felt Birmingham needed a contemporary, outward-looking church that could be within easy reach of students, and that didn't exist, and maybe the only way it was going to happen is if we tried to start something. But you really had it from the start, didn't you, as a church? You started, you said born pregnant, but you started the whole culture of Grace Church from the very beginning was to be a church planting church.
I think it was quite radical when we did Grace Church. Like, I think now we're used to hearing about church planting a lot more. But I think back then, in 2006, 2007, when we were first talking about it, like you said, we knew of churches like City that had accidentally planted, just come about because there was nothing. But being very intentional in the way that Grace Church was, I think that felt very radical and quite scary. I don't feel like we knew what we were doing. I mean, I wasn't leading it.
Well, I can assure you we didn't know what we were doing. And I do. Looking back now, I mean, I remember seriously sitting down, and I think it was we went away for the day actually with a bunch of the leaders, and just thinking we might be back in 6 months' time. We'll give it a go, but we might be back in 6 months' time. But it was I mean, you were, because you came in 2009.
2008 we moved to Birmingham and joined Grace Church in early 2009. So I guess it was a couple of years into Grace Church's kind of story, and one of the things that actually attracted my wife and I to the church was the vision and the DNA of church planting, which we also had a growing kind of passion for ourselves. So Grace Church felt like a very natural fit of a church for us at that time. We settled in very quickly with that, I think.
Well, I think one of the things was the fact that so many people from City still talked about the early days when we planted, that although it felt quite a scary thing to be involved in a church plant at Grace Church, it did also feel like something that had been instinctively in the DNA of the church. So you used to talk about being sort of an accidental church planter, but I think that back then in those very early days of City, I still think that there was something in the ether that people, there was always an urgency, an expectation that there would be more church plants to come about down the line. And I think, you look at a city like Birmingham, it's 1.1 million people, growing by 100,000 people every 10 years. The need for churches to be planted in every community, every part of the city is just enormous in a place like this. So I think
that DNA did carry through to Grace Church. So the group that we started the Gate Church with a year and a half ago were a group of people who had come to Grace Church in the 2 years before. So other than myself and Annalie and one other person, most people had come to church just in a couple of years before. But I think a group of young people who, in some senses, I guess a whole range of reasons why they ended up at Grace Church, but there was that vision and that outward lookingness that kind of, it was always on the cards that would be church planting. We didn't know where or what that would look like or who would be involved. But I guess it did galvanise the church on mission, and people were drawn into that, I think, through.
I wonder whether another thing that came with it was a love for Birmingham, that maybe there was something about both Grace Church and City that said that Birmingham isn't just a place where we just happen to live, but it's a place that we care about, and just putting that vision of, you know, those 1.1 million people like quite high up. And I think for us, one of the big things about planting was just it came from a love for and a calling to Birmingham. And maybe that's similar for lots of people, that it gave us a passion for the place where we were at. So it was the planting as well, because that was how you did something about that passion. But I think just having that big passion for the city, that heart for the lost, that desire to do something radical about it, was something that came through to all of us from City originally, I think.
And actually, so a lot of people who landed in our churches maybe didn't have that heart for the city at first, but it's something that's grown.
Yeah. I think of us as being, and to some degree, accidental church planters in terms of how the gate came about, because, you know, I remember sitting down with a map of Birmingham thinking, oh, we ought to plant a church. It would be wonderful to be involved in a church plant and being, you know, and where would we do that and that sort of thing. And just, I remember sort of sitting down and having physically ring two areas. One was Atwood Green, one was Longbridge, where you ended up, and kind of we just started sort of thinking through that. And then we were praying for Atwood Green, and you guys were there, and Helen was there as well. I think there was only 3 of you at the time who were coming to Grace Church from that community. And then we started praying together about that. And I was saying to you and Annalie, you should think about planting a church here, and this would be great. But then we saw the Lord really answer those prayers in terms of a core team start to come about. And then, you know, 3 people became 8 people, 8 people became 16 people. We had a community group out there that became 2 community groups. And, you know, I feel like we didn't initiate that. I felt like we were following.
Yeah, it was a long process, wasn't it? I mean, it was years, and even in some senses, my personal process of kind of coming to lead the church plant was quite a gradual one. Sometimes I'm being pushed by you, and there's various conversations along the way, and encouraged by you.
Waterboarding.
But yeah, like you said, I think God was definitely leading in that, and we've seen his blessing through that, which hasn't meant levelling the paths and making everything straightforward. There's been a lot of blood, sweat and tears.
So maybe here's the difference. When we started, we didn't come to Birmingham to plant. There was no purpose for us in being church planters. We didn't see that, didn't get it. You guys did, but you just didn't know where that would be. So we were accidental in the sense we didn't have an idea that we would be church planters. You had the idea. The passion for planting is what has been continued through. We sort of caught it, and then you guys really carried that through. So for you, it was not you weren't sure where it would be or when it would be. You were just looking for the opportunity, and you were prayerfully asking, Lord, open the door, give us an opportunity, show us where that might be. But you were always looking for the possibility, always thinking we should be planting if we could. Where would that be? And I think in that sense, that's the sense in which you were sort of born pregnant, to use that language. You started with the knowledge of when we can, we will church plant. We don't know where it's going to be. It could be anywhere. We prayerfully ask that God would allow us and use us in that sense. And that's where the gate came from. So I take your point. You were in that sense accidental. But in that sense, there was a very clear agenda and desire to be a church planting church. And we didn't have that at the start at City, but we soon caught it. And it's fantastic to see that that's now in the culture. It's true of Christchurch, Longbridge, and you're only a few months old. Yeah,
well, I wonder whether for us, there was something that when I was at university, which was kind of 2000, 2003, as a student at City, which is where I started off, there was very much a culture of, if you're gifted, you should think about gospel ministry. But at that time, what that looked like would be going to Bible college, taking an associate pastor job somewhere, and becoming part of an existing church. And I think the thing that changed for me is from that first point of people saying to me, 16 years ago now, you should think about full-time ministry, to ending up becoming the pastor of a plant, you know, the last September in 2015, was 2 things. It was this passion for Birmingham that we've talked about, but also this fact that planting was possible, that actually in a city like Birmingham, with City just up the road and Grace Church there, that actually planting wasn't going into the middle of nowhere where there was no one. It was actually having other churches standing by you to work together to do something new. And I think as we went to Bible college, we suddenly thought, oh, this is how loving Birmingham, being called into pastoral ministry, fit together. It's not about going into an existing church. It's actually about saying, where's God calling us to so that we can plant a new church? And I think it was also the realisation that we could do that in Birmingham in a way that we couldn't somewhere that we didn't know, because we had people who would support us and stand with us and look after us to do that, which has very much been our experience.
And something of the process that was normalised, I guess, in terms of, I think I wouldn't necessarily have ever considered church planting, except I happened to be around when City started and saw the process, and it sort of normalised it in my head that that's something that ordinary Christians can do, or it's certainly something that, if you're thinking about
and maybe
Christian leadership.
The last thing that's worth us mentioning, just as part of this conversation, is of course the 2020 network means that there is that wider support than the church that had helped to plant you, but actually a network of 15 or so church planters within different denominations and traditions, but all committed to the same things. There's a vision for the city of Birmingham, a conviction that church planting has to be the way to reach the city, and a desire to serve, love, support, pray for one another in our church planting endeavours. And that's just, again, gives you greater confidence that, I could be part of a church planting church in a place where there are other brothers and sisters and church leaders and so on who are looking out for me and looking after me, and we can serve one another. I mean, that's a great part of this conversation, isn't it? That we're looking out and loving and serving one another as churches in the city.